Hey, how you doing? Jose Sierra Jr., Two Countries, One Life. What's going on, brothers? Thought to talk to you today. My son and I have been kicking this around. He's filming me right now, so maybe he'll talk a little bit at the end. I want to show you what so far I've found in research. This is important because I've been all over Texas and New Mexico, and I'm learning a lot from the people who have basically lost their identity, the Tejano. Who in the hell is a Tejano and where does he come from? We got to talk about this today. Tejanos, people that are either born in Texas or families that were originated from Texas who have Texas roots. These are Tejanos. But I went to a meeting in South Texas last May or so, and I went down there to listen to a professor out of the Rio Grande Valley, University of Texas. And I find the professors interesting because I like to hear what they are telling the people and the kids about. Well, this professor, we had to pay money to see this professor. This professor was telling us the current history that's available for the Tejano kids in the Rio Grande Valley area and other parts of Texas. And his history line is from the 1600s all the way up to 1848. Now, we at Two Countries, One Lie here specify from 1848 to now. But I wanted to see what he had to say before 1848. That was kind of my curiosity. I wanted to see what he knew about our history as Tejanos. So when we were down there, he gave his lecture. And when he gave us this lecture, at the end he says, "Does anybody have any questions?" And nobody raised their hand. I stood up and raised my hand. I said, "Professor, I'm not going to give you his name. I try not to do that to people. You just know that there are witnesses to this. There was about 75 or so people, maybe 100 people, I don't remember exactly, that were in the audience that witnessed it, who live in the valley down there." And this professor said, "Does anybody have any questions? I'll answer any question what I just talked about from 1600 or so to 1848. And when I raised my hand and stood up, I was the only one at that time, at the beginning. I sort of broke the ice. I said, "Professor, I have just one question for you." This man was in his probably late 70s, early 80s, right in that area, in his 70s possibly. And he had been teaching 40 to 50 years, something like that. So he was well-versed, an older guy, and he understood a lot of the history. And I said, "This may be to you a simple question, but I'd like to see how you answer it." And he says, "Okay, my son, go ahead, ask away." I said, "Professor, what is a Mexican?" And you know what? The people laughed. They giggled. They thought it was a crazy question. And I waited, and guess what? The professor never laughed. He didn't smile at all. He didn't say a word. He just stood there staring at me. I said, "What is a Mexican? I just want to hear what you got to say. Can you answer that for me, please?" 2 to 4 minutes went by and there was no answer, but he had a concerned look. And all of the giggles, the people that thought I was crazy for asking that question, they were dying down. They were not laughing either. Now it got quiet, got eerily quiet. And the professor, about maybe 4 or 5 minutes into it, before he answered, he just gave a concerned looks, like he was thinking about it. So I stood up and I said, "Hey, Professor, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to ask you a question. I just thought you might have an answer for it." I said, "So, I don't mean to make anything out of this." And he goes, "No." He says, "No, that's okay, my son. That's a good question. But it's a complex question. I don't know exactly how to answer it." I said, "Well, you know what? Out of my 40 years of research," I said, "I think I have an answer." And he goes, "Well, maybe you'd like to share it with us." I said, "Sure, I would." I said, "What we are is indigenous people. That's what a Mexican Tejano is. Plain and simple. Do we want to be identified as Mexicans? No, we weren't born in Mexico. We're Mexican Americans. We'll accept that. Seems like Donald Trump doesn't like to call you that. He likes to call everybody Mexicans, like it's a bad thing, a demeaning thing, an unjust thing. I said, but we're really indigenous people. And he sort of stared, and he says, I couldn't argue with that. Something like that, he said. I said, because the reality of it is this. If you go back far enough in time, which he did, he went back to probably the 1700s. What do you think was sitting here in Texas? Or at that time was called either Spain or Mexico, because it was either territory of Mexico, Spain, or France. What do you think was here? There was no Anglos here yet. Anglos didn't come over till Columbus and all those people started to pile in. So in the 1600s, it was very few Anglos here. But those Anglos came from Europe. And finally, the Spaniards came over in droves to South Texas. And they started claiming land for Spain and France, naturally. But Spain had a big issue of dominance. And what happened is, those people that were living here were indigenous people. Why is that important? Well, because when it came to the Treaty of 1848, Guadalupe Hidalgo, it meant everything. So, this session tonight is about Tejanos, who were living there, your ancestors, my ancestors, who owned land grants of Spanish or Mexican descent. Who are we? We are indigenous people. That's what we are. Oh, really? We don't look like an Aztec Indian. We don't look like a Mayan. Mayans, Aztecs, I don't know, maybe 5 foot tall, jet black hair, no beards, as Indians had no beards, thick hair. We're all bald. Light-colored hair, light-colored skin, European. How could we be Mexicans? Well, that all happened because of 1848. And that is, where did we come from? Was from different areas. We came from different lives and different indigenous people. And we came from different worlds, such as the European theater. We were, at that time in 1848, there were Spaniards, Italians, French, German, and a whole bunch of other potpourri from Europe that were in Texas and owned land, married to Mexicans. So, if indigenous were the only people that were here, then we have an interesting development now. I learned this part of this puzzle from two very fine men in San Antonio, Ran Rocha and Antonio Diaz, and they gave me their fill on what their aspects of their history was, being of Yaqui Indian or other type of Mexican American Indians, which they like to be called. And they're not far from the truth. They are right close to the truth. But why don't we have that today? Why are we still called Mexicans? Where did we come from and how did we get in this position? And that's what I'm going to try to give to you today within this 15-20 minute clip. Because what I have discovered is this. That when we were living here with the North American Indians, and we were the Mexican Indians, it was two different worlds that were merged into one indigenous world. Because that's all that was in the North American continent. I don't care what any history book says, that's all that was here until the Europeans arrived. And when the Europeans came in, everything changed. These people lived in peace and harmony. Oh, they fought amongst themselves. But what country doesn't? What tribes don't? They all have their differences, and they settle them accordingly. Not through major wars, but conflicts and certain battles. They needed to set the seating arrangement within their countries, which was, at that time, Mexico and the United States. North American Indians up north, Mexican Indians on the bottom. So how did it change? Well, I told you who we are. We're all ancestors from these indigenous or European people. What are we? We're a blend. We're a blend of those types of people. Maybe 10% from Europe, and 90% was from the Aztec and Mayans. And also the North American Indians, because they also married Mexicans. Again, what the white man calls us, or the Anglo calls us. But we were all Indians, indigenous people. Why didn't it go that way? Here it comes. Because in 1845, Texas becomes a state. Now my ancestor, Jose Narciso Cavazos, who was one of the 433 land grant originators, he owned the largest section of a land grant in Texas, now known as the King Ranch, who basically stole the land from us. But I'm not getting into that. That's just what we have been told generation to generation. And it's more likely true than not. But here it comes. If in 1845, and it's important to remember these 2 years, 1845, Texas becomes a state. Texas becomes a state in 1845. If you're living on Texas soil in 1845, wouldn't you automatically be a U.S. citizen if they turn it into a state? That's when it was annexed. Look it up in your history book. I didn't write it. Probably written by an Anglo. 1845 is what it states. I have talked to professors about this, and they scratch their heads because I bring up questions about the status quo, about believing what we've been taught by the Anglos all our lives. And I tell them all, we need to rewrite our history. We need to understand where we came from, who we are, and what this is all about, so we can find our identity. Because here's the question I asked a professor in New Mexico, and he couldn't give me an answer. The other date that's important, I'll write it up here, is when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was ratified. February the 2nd, 1848. I want everybody to see that one. That's when Texas was bought from Mexico. It was a state in 1845, but it wasn't purchased till 1848. Well, if it was a state in 1845, why did it have to go to a treaty? And the treaty had to give you a choice. If you were a Tejano Mexicano and owned land, you had to make a choice. You either had to claim yourself as a U.S. citizen, or you got a chance to leave and go back to Mexico as a Mexican citizen. Why would we be given a choice if Texas was already a state? Why would we have to, 3 years later, have to make a decision? Martha Menchaca, in one of her books, writes down that 90% stayed and 10% left back to Mexico. They left their land and sold it or whatever because they did not want to live in that foreign country at that time. They wanted to go back to Mexico. 90% stayed. That means 90%, the overwhelming majority, stayed on the land in Texas of 1845, and now in 1848, they got to pick and make a decision. Why would they have to pick? Aren't they U.S. citizens by the Declaration of 1845, the annex of Texas to become a state? Why were we given a choice? I'm going to tell you why. And this is what the historians have all missed. Because in 1813 and 1817, The United States is on record making treaties with Comanches and Apaches. The treaties that were made was to put them on reservations. It was a set of lands for these Indians, American Indians, that would turn around and say, this is your land for life. You own this land. Oh, really? Look it up. 1813, 1817. Those treaties are well documented, well discussed by Indians, Native Americans. They all know those treaties. And there was others. I'm just giving those two as examples. But remember, they were 1813, 1817. Way before this happened. So why weren't we looked at as indigenous? Why? Why didn't they make us citizens in 1845 in Texas, and they waited 3 years later and they had to concoct some crazy deal where we could get to declare what we want to call ourselves? Why would they do that? Because it's not written in any history book. You're not going to find this anywhere. You're going to have to read between the lines. That's how this history is. And the Anglos have written the history books. So you're getting their spin on this. Well, I'm giving you the Tejano spin on this. And our professors in Texas and New Mexico and California, we need to all start of rewriting history the way we see it, the way we know it, not the way some Anglo tells us about it. Because usually it's skewed to tell what they want you to hear. The reason they didn't call you indigenous in the treaty in 1848 is because if that treaty was right in 1848, Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, then here's what they would say if they called us indigenous. That they would have to be given their lands just like the American Indians, North American Indians got, and they would have to live on it forever. Here's the problem with that. The North American Indians didn't have titles to their lands. They didn't have deeds to their lands. That's why they were hoarded and put on no man's land out there somewhere, and that's how they got their reservations. To this day, they still live on. That would have been a problem had they called you an indigenous person. Why? Because every one of those Tejanos that lived on that land in Texas in 1848, 1845, if they were indigenous, they had deeds. They had titles from the King of Spain, from the Mexican government. They had titles, claims to their lands. If we were called indigenous, we'd still be on those lands today. And this is the history that nobody knows about. I've got professors scratching their heads. They don't even know how to rebut this. And I tell them all, prove me wrong. You read between the lines and tell me where I'm wrong. You tell me how this all happened without giving an interesting explanation, without getting complicated. I said the reality of it is this. Once they had already declared treaties in 1817, 1813 with Indians, North American Indians, they would have to do the same thing with us. And we had titles and deeds, and those were our reservations, and it would be our land to this day. The King Ranch wouldn't own that. We'd still own it. A Cavazos family and genealogy that follows. They'd all be the owners of that land, and the United States could not take that land forever. That's why they didn't call you indigenous. The reason they didn't call you indigenous is because they wanted your land. They wanted to put you on a reservation, but you already owned your land. What a dilemma. This is the part of history that you're not told, that people don't understand, that people are lied to about. And to this day, I challenge all professors. Prove me wrong. I'm telling you as a Tejano that this was why the reason they waited 3 more years, because they didn't know what to do with us. They didn't understand how do we deal with these people that own this land. The only way to get the land away from them is call them Mexicans. Don't call them indigenous. Oh, no, we can't do that. Then you got to have a special treaty. And they're going to be on their own lands that they already own. And to this day, I would be living on the King Ranch and it would be my land or my ancestors or my family's land. So the reality of it is this. I'm giving you a snapshot of what took years of research to do. I've already talked to many professors, and I challenge anybody here on this YouTube internet to prove me wrong. Prove me wrong that this is not what really happened. And I challenge them all to start rewriting Mexican-American history. And we want to write that history the way we understand it now, because we've never been told the truth. And it's time for the truth. So I ask you all to digest this, because I've done a lot of work on this. And I thank again Antonio Diaz and Ran Rocha for waking me up, because they're the ones that started to make me think. And they are the ones that made me understand that this got deeper than I thought. But I always tell people, always keep an open mind, because you never know what's out there. And anything could change what you really think. This little word has changed the way I think. You may not agree, but prove me wrong. Don't come telling me we're not indigenous. Oh yeah? Then tell me what we are. I'm going to ask you, who are we? What are we? And where did we come from? You tell me if you can come up with a better answer. And put it on YouTube and call either get on my webpage or get on my Facebook page at Two Countries, One Lie and tell us where we're wrong. But I'm going to tell you, you're going to find out I'm not wrong. And what we need is to wake up our kids. We've done a terrible job of educating our children into what their history really was. They don't even know who we are. They don't know what we are. And they don't even know where we came from. It's time for change, and it's time for Tejanos to step up and do the right things. I want to thank you very much. I'll let my son make the last closing statement. Thank you, and keep in tune. Two Countries, One Lie is still here.
I hope you enjoyed the documentary that my father has put together for you. As he finds more information on what truly happened to Tejanos and what happened to their lands being stolen, we will continue to put these videos out. We are starting up again. So be patient with us. About every week or every 2 weeks we'll be putting out a video. And again, any comments or questions, you can leave comments below or send us questions through the email at dospaisesunamentira@comcast.net, and we'll be happy to take your email and responses. Thank you very much. Have a good day.